Hey guys, today I'm going to show you how to make the pizza dough that we're going to use in school. I'm not going to give the specific amounts. I'll give that in class, partly because I'm not really sure if this dough is going to make too much and I might need to adjust the recipe. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to start with our liquids. Now this is my cup of water that I've added some sugar to, and then I put my yeast in there. And I don't know if you can see it, but instead of just being little lumps floating in the water, it has converted into this nice foamy scummy stuff. It actually doesn't look that pretty, but it's supposed to look like that. And then I have my flour in the bowl. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my salt, and I'm going to put my salt on the side of the flour over here. And the reason for that is because when I put my yeast in, yeast doesn't like salt. Salt is a killer. And yeast is actually a live bacteria. So I want to make sure that the yeast has a chance to bond with some flour before it ends up hitting the salt and having the saltiness of it kill it. So I've got my water, I've got my salt, I got my yeast, and let's see what else I need. Nope, that's it, other than my oil. So I'm going to make, and this is typical of most yeast doughs, you're going to make a well in the middle. So you can see my little well there. I got a little hole. Make my little volcano here. If this was baking soda and vinegar, it would be blowing up. But, well, it's just my yeast. And as you can see, it's nice and bubbly and foamy there. So we're just going to scrape it all out because we're going to need all the yeast in there. And it doesn't do us any good leaving it in the mixing bowl or the measuring cup. We want it in our ingredients. So we got that there. I'm going to stir that in just a tiny little bit. Now, I did need to remind you that the water that I put the yeast and the sugar in had to be a very specific temperature. You want it as best you can between 105 and 110. And the reason for that is because even though they call it dry active yeast, the yeast actually needs to be activated by temperature and by food. The sugar is the food for the yeast, and if you leave sugar, water, and yeast together, and the yeast doesn't do anything except sit there, like the little boba leaves in the boba tea that you get, sorry about that, it means that your yeast is no longer alive. It's died of old age or extreme temperature conditions, and it's not going to make a nice dough. Now, my dough is not going to be very soft at this point because I don't have enough liquid in it. So the next thing I need to do is I need to add 1/4 of a cup of oil. Now, I like to use olive oil. I was going to use this liquid measure, but it doesn't have the 1/4 cup measure on there. So let me step aside here. I've got to have a 1/4 measuring cup somewhere in my drawers. Here I do. Okay. Now, you're not actually supposed to use the dry measures in place of the liquid measures, but since it's only 1/4 of it, it's not going to make that big a deal. And since it's a yeast dough, I can always add more liquid to it if it's not the right texture. So I've got my oil. I'm going to make sure at eye level that it's flush, and then I'm just going to put that on in there. And I'm very carefully going to put my oil into my liquid measuring bowl so that it doesn't make a mess all over my counter. And then I'm going to keep stirring here, and I want to just stir it all up. You'll notice I'm using a spatula. You can use one of the cooking spoons if you want, but this is a good time to just keep stirring. You want to clean all the edges off the bowl. There's no point in leaving any flour there. Okay, it looks like it's ready to start cleaning the bowl. You'll notice when I flip it, it literally picks up the flour that's there, and there's not a whole lot of flour left. Okay, so that tells us that we're about as blended as we're going to be this way. And so the next thing we need to do is we need to knead our flour. And I don't need N-E-E-D like you want something. This is knead, K-N-E-A-D, and it's a very specific way of handling yeast-based doughs. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a little bit of flour out here. You guys aren't going to have one of these fancy shakers in the classroom, so you're just going to make sure you have like maybe a tablespoon of flour and just put it on there. And then you're just going to take the dough that you put in your bowl and just sort of plop it on there. It's so satisfying to make that sound. I'm going to put the bowl aside. And then to knead the dough, what you're going to do is you're going to take the palm and the heel of your hand, you're going to push it away from you, and then you're going to take the corner of the dough, flip it over, rotate it, and just keep doing that. Sorry, I'm going too fast. Let me start that again. Palms down, flip over, rotate, flip over, rotate, flip over, rotate, and you'll notice that I'm collecting all of the flour that I've got here. Now you can get two-handed if you want and put both palms and rotate, take the ends in, rotate it again, and basically when we do biscuits, we just want to handle the dough a little bit. We want to pound it out and we want to laminate it. This is not the same thing as creating layers in biscuits. This is actually making sure that every single piece of flour gets abused. Why would we want to abuse the flour? Because cooks are mean. We whip the eggs and beat the cream, and I can tell from my dough being a little bit sticky that I'm going to need to add just a little bit more flour for it to use up. See how it's clinging to my hands there? It's sticky, sticky. We don't want it to do that. We want it to be a little bit drier. Now, the reason we are actually abusing the flour and making sure that every single piece of flour in here gets stretched is because of something in the flour called gluten. Gluten is a protein, and the more you work the flour, the stronger the gluten gets. It's sort of like a workout for muscles. The more you work out, the stronger your muscles get. And I'm going to need just a little bit more flour there. See how my dough is sticky? And it's pulling back a little bit. We want just a little bit drier. So we're just going to keep kneading, and realistically, you want to knead this for about 7 to 8 minutes. That seems like a long time because it is. Now at this point you can see that the dough is starting to clear itself. I can pull it off my fingers. It's not going to stick anymore. I may add just a little bit of flour because I'm a weirdo. I like my dough a little bit dry. Pizza restaurant likes their dough a little bit softer because you get a nice soft crust. And you'll notice that I'm rolling it around to pick up a little bit of flour. So someone's going to ask, Miss, why didn't I just put more flour in the recipe? And that's because you never actually know how much flour or dough recipe is going to use, depending on the humidity, the time of day, how old the flour is, how much protein is in there. All of these things can change the amount of liquid to flour that you need. And it's a little bit rainy outside. You can't see my windows, but it's kind of humid. So my flour is a little bit on the moist side, which means that I'm going to need to add a little extra flour to the water ratio so it doesn't stick. Now you'll notice as I'm kneading the dough, if you look at the counters, it's not leaving behind any dough. And I'm pushing on it pretty hard. And oops, I take it back. I found a wet spot in my dough, so I'm going to add a little bit more flour there. And that's part of it, is you want to make sure that all the dough is hydrated to the same level. So anyhow, we're building up our gluten, just like we're building up our muscles. And just like when you work out, you don't actually build the muscles while you're working. You build the muscle during your downtime, because as you're working out, you're going to rip it and tear it. And those little micro fissures, micro rips in your muscles need repairing, and your body doesn't want to have them tear again. So build it up a little bit bigger, a little bit stronger, a little bit tougher. And that's how you get more muscles. And that's how we're going to get our gluten. We're going to rip and tear all the proteins in here, and they're going to repair themselves bigger, stronger, faster. We can rebuild this dough, and it's going to go. Now, I keep getting sticky parts on my dough, and as long as I keep running into sticky parts, I know I need just a little bit more flour. You want to make sure that you pick up all the dough as you go, because you don't want to end up with any pieces of dough that are not hydrated and textured the same as the others. And you'll notice I just rolled my dough and picked up all my extra flour. And it's looking pretty good. Now when you pull your dough, See how it pulls back? Let's try that again. I'm going to stretch my dough. Notice my hand's in the same place with the dough. It wants to collapse on itself. I don't know, it's taking my hands with it. It's sucking me into the dough hole. Oh no, it's the black hole of pizza. And it's taking me in. And you'll notice this whole time I've been talking, I've been rolling and rolling. And I roll it out maybe at this point 2 or 3 rolls out. And then I'm collecting it there. And you always want to rotate so you're working with a different section of dough. You just want to do that, and you can actually feel the dough once you've been doing this a while. You can feel that it feels like dough. It's got a very specific texture. Now this is one texture for pizza dough. If you were doing bread, it'd be pretty much close to the same texture of white bread. A wheat bread would have a little scruffier texture. And if you're doing something like an instant bread or a tea bread that doesn't use any yeast at all, you wouldn't be doing this process, because if your dough doesn't have yeast in it, you don't need to knead it, because it's the interaction of the yeast and the gluten that's going to make your dough, give it that stretch and build the dough muscles. And that's it. We've got our dough here. It pretty much cleans itself. It's a little bit tacky, which is what you want. If you have nothing, there's no tacky, you can feel the tacky. I don't know if you can see the tacky. But if your dough doesn't feel a little tacky, almost like it's got a little bit of wet glue on it, then your dough is too dry. I've got this nice tacky dough, and then all I'm going to do with this, guys, is I'm going to put this in a Ziploc baggie and I'm going to leave it in the fridge. Why? Because class is only 52 minutes long and this dough is going to take a while to rise. Now, if I were doing this at my house for myself, I would just put it right back in my handy dandy bowl. I'd put a little bit of oil in it. I'm going to grease the pan here. So this is what you're going to do if you're at home doing this, not if you're at school. And then you just want to take the dough. Oh, look, it's got nice tacky to it because it's sticking to my counter. All right, that tells me I've got the right amount of tacky to it because it came off when I was kneading it, but when I left it there, it decided to stick. All right, so I'm going to put my dough down, give it a good pat, and I'm going to flip it over because whatever the oil that I put in the pan just got on the top of the dough. That's going to keep it from drying out. Now, if this is for me at home, I'm going to leave it out on my counter, and as soon as it doubles in bulk, depending on how active the yeast is, that can take anywhere from 1 to 3 hours. I'm going to punch it down, knead it once or twice, and then put it back again and let it rise again. And then I'll shape it and put it in the pan. But because we're in the classroom, we're actually going to take our dough and put them in Ziploc baggies, correctly labeled with your class period and station on them. And then since yeast needs time to rise, it's going to rise overnight in the refrigerator. Now, this only works if your refrigerator is set above freezing. If you freeze your dough, remember that the yeast is an active ingredient and it's alive. If you freeze it, it's going to hibernate. It's not going to do anything. So we're going to put these in Ziploc baggies. We're going to leave them in the fridge and we're going to get a 24-hour rise out of it. And then tomorrow, before school starts, I will pull them all out on the counters in the nice warm classroom. And I'll let the dough rise up to room temperature. And then we're going to take this dough that is going to magically be like twice this size. And you're just going to take a knife or a spatula. You're going to cut it in half. And you're going to cut each half again. And then you're just going to roll it out into your pizza shapes. Now I can tell from the dough that I'm making that this recipe is going to provide way too much dough. So honest truly, I think that half of this dough cut in half and half again. So you got 1/8 of a piece of dough is going to be enough for that pizza pan. All right, because that's about the size, your pizza pans are about the size of my hand there. So you're going to use half the dough. The other half of the dough we're going to have to make breadsticks with, and then we'll just put them in some dipping sauce and have that. So we'll make our own breadsticks. And see how easily I just rolled that out there? That's all you need to do on the pizza pans. You don't need a rolling pin. Just put the dough straight on the pizza pan. Now if you want to roll it separate, and I don't know if you can see me doing this here, You'll notice I'm holding it, and remember I talked about the dough stretching? Well, I'm just letting it stretch down, and that's how it is getting a little bit bigger. And the fancy pizza chefs throw it in the air, whee, and then they rotate it like that. They put it on their hands and they rotate it around so that it spins, and that's what the fancy pizza chefs do. I am not a fancy pizza chef, so I'm just going to stretch my dough a little bit around the edges. As I go, I'm going to get my dough a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger as we go, and then I can just put it right on the pizza pan there and add my toppings.